What happens when Hollywood's most respected icon meets a host who's lost all respect for boundaries? You won't believe what unfolds when Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director who's commanded screens for over 6 decades, sits down for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview that turned into television's most shocking confrontation of the year. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when respect meets recklessness on live television. The atmosphere in Studio 6A was electric, as Jimmy Kimmel prepared for what his producers had billed as a career-defining interview. Eastwood, now in his 90s but still carrying that unmistakable presence that made him a legend, had agreed to appear on the show to discuss his latest directorial project. The green room buzz suggested this would be television gold, but nobody could have predicted the explosive confrontation that was about to unfold. As the show's familiar theme music played and the cameras rolled, Kimmel bounded onto the stage, with his characteristic smirk, clearly relishing the opportunity to sit across from cinema royalty. The audience erupted in applause as Eastwood made his entrance, moving with the measured dignity that had defined his 6-decade career. He settled into the guest chair with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove to anyone. "Ladies and gentlemen, the one and only Clint Eastwood," Kimmel announced, his voice carrying that familiar tone that regular viewers had come to associate with his more controversial interviews. From the moment Eastwood sat down, there was something different in the air. The veteran actor's eyes held a steely focus that seemed to cut right through the studio lights and manufactured atmosphere. The interview began innocuously enough, with Kimmel asking about Eastwood's new film and his approach to directing at his age. Eastwood answered with his characteristic brevity, each word measured and deliberate. But those paying close attention could sense something brewing beneath the surface. Kimmel's questions carried an edge, a subtle mockery disguised as playful banter that seemed to probe for weakness in the Hollywood legend. "You know, Clint, a lot of people are wondering if maybe it's time to pass the torch to younger filmmakers," Kimmel said with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I mean, the industry has changed so much since your Dirty Harry days. Do you ever feel like you're directing movies for an audience that doesn't exist anymore?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Eastwood's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. "Jimmy, I've been making movies since before you were born. I've seen trends come and go. What doesn't change is good storytelling and treating people with respect." The emphasis on the word respect was subtle, but unmistakable, and Kimmel either didn't catch it or chose to ignore it. Instead, he leaned forward with that predatory smile that his critics had come to despise. "But surely you have to admit that some of your recent films have been, well, let's say they've been more appreciated by critics than audiences. Don't you think it might be time to consider retirement?" The studio audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the light-hearted celebrity chat they'd expected. Eastwood's expression remained unchanged. But there was something in his eyes now, a flash of the steel that had made his screen presence so commanding. "I retire when I'm ready to retire, not when a talk show host thinks I should," Kimmel laughed. But it was a hollow sound that echoed strangely in the suddenly tense studio. "Hey, I'm just asking the questions America wants to know. You've got to admit, some of your political views haven't exactly aged well either. That whole empty chair thing at the Republican convention? People are still talking about that." The mention of Eastwood's 2012 Republican National Convention appearance, where he had addressed an empty chair representing President Obama, was clearly a calculated provocation. The actor's hands, which had been resting calmly on the armrests of his chair, now gripped them slightly tighter. "That was my choice to make, and I stand by it. Just like it's my choice to walk out of here if this is the level of discourse you want to have." The threat was delivered with such quiet authority that it seemed to suck the air out of the room. Kimmel's smile faltered for just a moment before returning with renewed intensity. "Oh, come on, Clint. You can't be that sensitive. This is just good television. The audience loves it when we dig a little deeper. But Eastwood wasn't backing down. There's a difference between digging deeper and being disrespectful. I came here to talk about my work, not to be your punching bag for cheap laughs. The veteran actor's voice carried the weight of decades in Hollywood, the authority of someone who had earned his place through talent and persistence, rather than controversy and provocation. The contrast with Kimmel's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control of the interview was becoming more apparent with each exchange. "Look, I'm sorry if you feel I'm being disrespectful," Kimmel said, though his tone suggested anything but apology. "But you have to understand, this is how modern television works. We push boundaries. We make people uncomfortable. That's what gets ratings." Eastwood's response was delivered with the kind of quiet intensity that had made him a legend. "Maybe your problem is that you think making people uncomfortable is the same thing as being entertaining. Real entertainment doesn't require tearing people down." The studio had grown so quiet that the hum of the cameras seemed amplified. Even the production crew, visible in the shadows beyond the stage lights, had stopped their usual movement. This was no longer an interview. It was becoming something else entirely, a confrontation between two completely different philosophies of how to conduct oneself in the public eye. Kimmel, perhaps sensing that he was losing control of the situation, decided to double down. "You know what, Clint? Maybe you're right. Maybe I am being too hard on you. After all, you're practically a relic from another era. It must be tough watching the world change around you while you're still trying to make the same kinds of movies you made 40 years ago." The insult was delivered with a smile, but it landed like a physical blow. Eastwood's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the legendary actor's famous composure cracked just enough to reveal the fury building beneath the surface. But what came next would make that moment seem like a gentle breeze before a hurricane. The silence that followed was deafening. Eastwood sat perfectly still for what felt like an eternity, his weathered hands now visibly gripping the armrests of his chair. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a dangerous quiet that made everyone in the studio lean forward. "You know, Jimmy, I've been in this business for 70 years. I've worked with legends. I've created characters that will outlive both of us, and I've earned my place through respect and hard work, not by tearing down better men for a cheap laugh." Kimmel's smile widened, sensing blood in the water. He had pushed one of Hollywood's most respected figures to the edge, and the ratings gold this would generate was already flashing in his eyes. "Oh, come on, Clint. Don't be so dramatic. I'm just having a little fun with you. Besides, isn't this better than another boring promotional interview where you grunt out one-word answers?" The mockery in his voice was unmistakable now, and the studio audience began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. This had crossed the line from entertainment into something uglier, something that felt like watching a bully corner his victim. But Eastwood wasn't just any victim, and what happened next would remind everyone exactly who they were dealing with. "You think this is fun?" Eastwood's voice cut through the studio like a blade. "You think humiliating guests on your show makes you some kind of comedian? Let me tell you something about comedy, son. Real comedy doesn't require making other people feel small. It requires talent, something you seem to have confused with cruelty." The word "son" was delivered with such condescension that it hit Kimmel like a slap across the face. His carefully maintained composure began to crack, and the mask of the affable host started to slip away, revealing something much less pleasant underneath. "Wow, okay. I guess the rumors about you being difficult to work with are true. No wonder your last few movies bombed at the box office." It was a low blow, and everyone in the studio knew it. Eastwood's recent films, while critically acclaimed, hadn't achieved the commercial success of his earlier work, and Kimmel had just weaponized that fact with surgical precision. The veteran actor's jaw clenched, and for the first time since the interview began, his legendary composure showed genuine cracks. "Those movies meant something," Eastwood said, his voice now carrying an edge that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. "They told stories that mattered. They weren't designed to pander to the lowest common denominator or chase whatever trend would get the most clicks. Unlike this circus you call a talk show. The insult hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down, in the center of the studio. Kimmel's face flushed red, and his carefully practiced television persona began to crumble entirely. Circus? This circus has been on the air for 20 years. This circus pays my bills and entertains millions of people every night. What have you done lately besides make movies that put people to sleep? The confrontation had now escalated beyond any pretense of professional discourse. Two men from completely different generations and philosophies were facing off in front of a live studio audience, and neither was backing down. Eastwood leaned forward in his chair, his eyes locked onto Kimmel's with an intensity that seemed to burn through the studio lights. "I've spent my career building something meaningful," Eastwood said, each word delivered with the precision of a marksman. "You've spent yours tearing down people who are better than you. That's the difference between us, Jimmy. I create, you destroy." The accusation hit its target with devastating accuracy. Kimmel's face contorted with anger, and all pretense of being the jovial host evaporated completely. "Better than me? You're a has-been actor who peaked in the 70s and refuses to admit it. At least I'm still relevant. At least people still care about what I have to say." The studio audience gasped audibly at the viciousness of the attack. This was no longer entertainment. It was character assassination being broadcast live to millions of viewers. But Eastwood, rather than being cowed by the assault, seemed to grow more formidable with each passing second. "Relevant?" Eastwood's laugh was cold and humorless. "Is that what you call this? Attacking guests who come on your show in good faith? If this is relevance, I'll take obscurity any day. At least I can sleep at night knowing I've never made a living by humiliating people who trusted me." The word "trusted" seemed to hit Kimmel particularly hard, and his response revealed just how far he was willing to go to maintain his position of power. "Trust? You came on this show knowing exactly what it was. Don't act like you're some innocent victim. You're here because your publicist told you it would be good for your image. Well, guess what? Your image is that of a cranky old man who can't handle a few jokes. Maybe that's why nobody wants to work with you anymore." The final insult was designed to be a killing blow, but it had the opposite effect. Instead of breaking Eastwood's spirit, it seemed to crystallize his resolve. The legendary actor stood slowly from his chair, his full height now towering over the seated host. The movement was deliberate, controlled, and somehow more threatening than any outburst of anger could have been. "Nobody wants to work with me?" Eastwood's voice was now barely above a whisper, but it carried through the studio with perfect clarity. "Jimmy, I've worked with the best actors, directors, and producers in this industry. I've been honored by my peers and respected by my colleagues. Can you say the same? Or do you just surround yourself with people who are afraid to tell you the truth about what you've become?" The question hung in the air like an executioner's axe, and Kimmel's face went pale as the implications sank in. He had pushed too far, revealed too much of his true nature, and now he was facing the consequences. But rather than backing down, he doubled down on his attack, his voice rising to a near shout. "What I've become successful. I've become relevant. I've become everything you used to be before the world moved on without you." The desperation in his voice was now unmistakable, and the studio audience watched in horrified fascination as one of television's most powerful hosts completely lost control. Eastwood looked down at the seated host with something approaching pity. And when he spoke again, his words carried the weight of finality. "Success without honor is just failure with better publicity, Jimmy. And right now, the whole world is watching you fail." The legendary actor turned toward the edge of the stage. But Kimmel wasn't finished. What he said next would seal his fate and create the most shocking moment in late-night television history. "Yeah, walk away. That's what you always do, isn't it?" Kimmel's voice cracked with desperation as he called out to Eastwood's retreating figure. You walk away from difficult conversations just like you walked away from your family, just like you walked away from your responsibilities. How many kids do you have again, Clint? How many of them actually speak to you? The words hit the studio like a bomb. The audience gasped collectively, and even the production crew, who had seen their share of controversial moments, stood frozen in shock. Kimmel had crossed a line that no professional broadcaster should ever cross, attacking not just Eastwood's career but his personal life and family relationships. Eastwood stopped dead in his tracks. For a moment he stood perfectly still, his back to the host, his shoulders rigid with controlled fury. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before he slowly turned around. When he faced Kimmel again, there was something in his eyes that made everyone in the studio take an involuntary step back. "What did you just say?" Eastwood's voice was so quiet it was barely audible, but it carried through the studio like thunder. The legendary actor began walking back toward the desk, each step deliberate and measured. "Did you just bring my family into this pathetic attempt at entertainment?" Kimmel, realizing he had gone too far but unable to back down without losing face completely, doubled down on his attack. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. You lecture me about honor and respect, but what about the respect you owe to your own children? How many different women? How many broken promises?" The studio audience was now completely silent, watching, in horrified fascination, as one of Hollywood's most respected figures faced the most personal attack imaginable on live television. Some people in the audience began shaking their heads in disgust, while others looked like they wanted to flee the studio entirely. Eastwood reached the desk and placed both hands on it, leaning forward until he was eye-level with the seated host. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet menace that had made him a legend in westerns and thrillers. "Jimmy, I've made mistakes in my personal life. I've never claimed to be perfect. But the difference between you and me is that I've never used other people's pain for my own gain. I've never turned human suffering into a punchline." The words were delivered with such controlled intensity that Kimmel visibly shrank back in his chair. But rather than apologizing or attempting to de-escalate, the host made one final, fatal mistake. "Oh, spare me the moral high ground routine. At least I'm honest about what I am. You're just a hypocrite hiding behind a tough guy image." The accusation of hypocrisy seemed to break something fundamental in Eastwood's restraint. The legendary actor straightened to his full height and looked down at Kimmel with an expression of such complete contempt that it seemed to physically diminish the host. "Honest about what you are?" Eastwood's voice rose slightly, but it remained controlled, deadly. "You're a bully, Jimmy. You're a small, cruel man who makes a living by making other people feel smaller. You hide behind your desk and your applause signs and your carefully edited highlight reels. But right now, with all of America watching, everyone can see exactly what you really are." The indictment was delivered with such authority that it seemed to suck all the energy out of Kimmel's defiance. The host's face went pale, and for the first time in the entire confrontation, he appeared to realize the magnitude of what he had done. But it was far too late for redemption. "You came after my work, and I could respect that," Eastwood continued, his voice now carrying the weight of decades of experience and wisdom. "You came after my age, my politics, my relevance, and I could handle that. But when you attack my family, when you try to turn my children into ammunition for your cheap shots, you cross a line that no decent person should ever cross." The legendary actor stepped back from the desk, his posture straight and dignified. "Despite everything that had transpired, I've been in this business for 70 years, Jimmy. I've seen bullies before. I've dealt with studio executives who thought they could intimidate me, directors who thought they could humiliate me, critics who thought they could destroy me. You know what they all had in common? They all thought they were more powerful than they actually were." Eastwood began moving toward the edge of the stage again, but this time his movement was different. This wasn't a retreat. It was a declaration. "The thing about bullies, Jimmy, is that they always reveal themselves eventually. Tonight you revealed yourself to millions of people. They saw you attack a guest who came here in good faith. They saw you mock someone's age and family. They saw you lose control when someone refused to be intimidated by your little performance. The studio was now so quiet that the hum of the cameras seemed deafening. Even Kimmel had fallen silent, his face a mask of dawning horror as he began to understand the career implications of what had just transpired. "You wanted ratings, Jimmy?" Eastwood's voice carried a note of dark satisfaction. "You wanted viral moments and social media buzz? Well, congratulations. You got them, but not in the way you hoped." The legendary actor reached the edge of the stage and turned back one final time. America just watched you destroy your own credibility in real time. They watched you prove that you're everything that's wrong with modern entertainment. Kimmel opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. He sat frozen behind his desk, finally understanding that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had expected to break down a Hollywood legend for his own entertainment, but instead, he had broken himself. "I came here tonight to talk about my work, to share something meaningful with your audience," Eastwood said, his voice now carrying a note of genuine sadness. "Instead, I got to witness the public suicide of a man's career. I've seen a lot of things in my time, Jimmy, but I've never seen someone destroy themselves so completely in front of so many people." The legendary actor shook his head slowly, more in sorrow than anger. "I hope it was worth it. I hope those few minutes of thinking you had power over me were worth throwing away 20 years of building your show. Because that's what you just did. You traded your reputation for a moment of cruelty, and everyone saw it happen." With that, Clint Eastwood turned and walked off the stage with the same quiet dignity he had carried into the studio. His exit was unhurried, controlled, and somehow more powerful than any dramatic storming off could have been. He simply walked, away from the wreckage of what had once been a professional interview, leaving behind a host who sat in stunned silence, finally understanding the magnitude of his catastrophic mistake. The studio audience remained frozen, uncertain whether to applaud, boo, or simply sit in shocked silence. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every second of Kimmel's humiliation as he sat alone behind his desk, the weight of his actions finally settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. As the studio doors closed behind the legendary actor, one thing was crystal clear. Jimmy Kimmel had just committed professional suicide on live television, and Clint Eastwood had walked away with his dignity intact, having delivered the most devastating takedown in late-night television history without ever raising his voice or losing his composure. The confrontation was over, but its consequences would reverberate through the entertainment industry for years to come.